Thank you for joining me for our study of Exodus in the Lifeway series. This is session 8, and the text is Exodus 22, verse 21 to 27, and Leviticus 19, verses 9 through 10. The title is Protection, and the lesson summary statement is God expects His people to protect the vulnerable. Now, this Sunday is Sanctity of Life Sunday, and so I want to help the class see how involved the church in America is in the rescuing and the dignity of human life. So I'm going to ask them some questions as it relates to my community. And I'm going to ask them, for example, who do you know who has food closets? And inevitably, the majority will be churches. Who has clothes closets? Again, it'll be churches. Who is providing lodging? We have Christian churches and ministries that are doing that. Who is helping if a young woman finds herself pregnant outside of marriage? And we have a pregnancy ministry in our community. What about adoption agencies? Where do you go for adoptions? Where do you go for grief ministries? And we have a number of churches that have the Grief Share ministry. What about addictions? And again, there's the Celebrate Recovery that are found in churches. And then there are things that I won't mention and ask their suggestions for, but there's counseling ministries, and many of those are Christians. There's a church in our community that has a ministry where they'll repair cars for people for the expense of the parts. There's disaster relief ministries. There are medical clinics that are free. And you just go down the list. And what I'm wanting to point out in going through this process and this discussion with my classes to show that the preponderance are Christian. It's Christians that have moved into these areas to provide for people. And then just how many of these are sponsored by atheists? To my knowledge, I'm unaware that of ministry. I might lean towards Planned Parenthood. That might be something of that nature. But then I want to ask, well, how many ministries are like this are sponsored by the cults like Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, or other religions like Islam or Buddhism? And to my knowledge, in my area, I'm not aware of any that are. There may be some out there, but I'm completely unaware of that. But in terms of Christians have stepped into many, many of these areas. And it's a reflection of God's people reflecting His character. What are we to draw from that? God expects His people to protect the vulnerable. Now, chapter 20 to 23 is called the Book of the Covenant. And what's happening in these chapters is an application, the practical application for the Ten Commandments. When you and I read these, we find many of them to be very strange and puzzling as to what is going on when God gives them this commandment. But you need to understand, I need to understand, that when Moses is giving these commandments, the people of God are leaning in because they're very interested in what he has to say, because these things do apply to them. We may have lost some of the understanding that makes these commandments significant, but it was very real and very practical to the people of God. The dominating concepts in the Book of the Covenant is redemption and worship and law. And the law reveals how to have a proper relationship with God. But as we mentioned before, the law comes after their redemption. So the law is not the way in which to be redeemed. We are redeemed, and we just simply are learning from the law how to live as redeemed people. And proper worship is important. And the law helps us to understand the God that we're worshiping. Now, they were familiar with the Egyptian gods and that kind of worship, and they're going to encounter the Canaanite gods and that kind of worship. They need to understand the God that they are serving, and the laws help them understand how to approach Him properly. So that's what's happening in these chapters. These laws are given for them to prepare them as they go to enter into the promised land, so that they don't get caught up in pagan worship, that they worship God correctly. These laws basically have two driving purposes. The first is how to correctly relate to God. We saw that in the Ten Commandments. And the second is how to correctly relate to others. And Jesus answered this when he was asked, what's the greatest commandment? He said, it's to love God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is like the first, in that you're to love your neighbor as you love yourself. And that's the big picture of what's happening in the Book of Covenant. How do we love God properly, and how do we love others properly? And our lesson today is God expects his people to protect the vulnerable. Now, what I want to do as I go through the lesson, I want to start out by pointing out what the application point is for each point. For example, exploitation. The word exploitation means to make use of wickedly or unfairly for one's own advantage. And the application point is believers are to care for vulnerable people. So with that in mind, I want to walk through the text giving some explanation of what this passage is saying. Let me just give you some examples. You must not exploit a resident alien or oppress him. Now, resident alien was someone who had not made a commitment to the covenant of God. If as a man, he had not been circumcised and brought into the covenant. He didn't possess land. He didn't have any kind of political standing as a citizen. And so this all made him very vulnerable to be taken advantage of. And it says you're not to exploit him, you're not to oppress him. The word oppress there is the same word that's used in chapter 3, verse 9, when it talks about what Pharaoh in Egypt did to the Israelites. And so he's simply saying, the way you were treated, you are not to treat people that way. And he says, it goes on in verse 21 to say, since you were resident aliens in the land of Egypt. Don't forget the grace that God showed you. Don't forget the way that God was good to you. And you need to remember that God treated you when you were an alien in another land and brought you out. You need to respond that way when it comes to people who are living in your land and they're not members of that society, that group. Verse 22, you must not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. That's a big issue in the Bible, and your studies will reveal that a widow had no political standing. Most of the legal issues were done by her husband. And so unless she had a son that took her in, she was greatly disadvantaged in society. And a fatherless child is even in a more vulnerable position. No one to care for them, and they could easily be exploited. And the Bible is very clear, brings it up again over and over. The widow and the fatherless child, that these people, that the Israelite society is to care for them and to protect them, because what it's revealing is the kind of God that they serve. Verse 23, if you do mistreat them, they will no doubt cry out to me, and I will certainly hear their cry. Now, if you want to get an enemy, just mistreat the widow, mistreat the fatherless child. And they cry out to God, and God comes to their defense. This is a very sobering thought, that the way I have treated this person makes me at odds with the living God of the universe. And notice verse 24, my anger will burn, and I will kill you with the sword. That's pretty serious. And what is often seen in the Old Testament is people like the Assyrians and the Babylonians. They were God's sword in punishing Israel for its sin against God, but also for the way they treated and exploited the most vulnerable in society. And he said, in fact, what's going to happen is you're going to experience what these people have been experiencing. Then your wives will be widows and your children fatherless. Now, I may go into more explanation about those things, but I want to go through that and just open their eyes to an understanding of the text. And then what I've done is I have asked a couple in our church who have adopted children to come and take a 10 minutes or so and just talk to us about the adoption process. We'd like to understand why what was the motivating factors, and what was the process that involved all of that, and what has it been? What have been their experience as adoptive parents? Now, we have a number of families in our church who have done foster children, and then that led to adoption. And it's a wonderful, wonderful act of grace on their part. And I just want the church to see an application of God's people who are taking care of the fatherless child. And there's a whole host of ministries like that. But I thought this would be a wonderful way of applying that. And it would be a wonderful culture to establish in our church, people having this kind of mindset. I had read that in our state of Oklahoma, that if every other church, some family member in that church took a foster child into their home, that we would empty the foster program in Oklahoma where children are being cared for in other people's homes. The second point that we lead to is the lending practices, verse 25 to 27. Again, the application point for this point is that believers are to offer dignity to those in need. So that's what we're driving at. It's helping poverty-stricken people. They also deserve our compassion, and we are forbidden from taking advantage of someone's misfortune. Again, I want to go through the text with some explanation. If you lend silver to my people, to the poor person among you, you must not be like a creditor to him. You must not charge him interest. Now, he's talking to the children of Israel. This is not a word against banking and loans. Again, go back into the context. These are people that are in the desert. These are people that are going to be conquering a land. And so the banking system and the loan system are just simply not in place. That won't come along until about 600 BC was the first awareness we have of people using coin as currency. And so what happened in that day prior to that is there was a bartering system, or there was working in order to earn something or to pay something off. And so that's the background of it. So you really can't bring it into the present day economy of our time. But he says, if you lend silver to people, he's talking about to Israelites, to the poor person among you, you must not be like a creditor to him. You must not charge him interest. Now, the poor person has gotten so desperate that he's actually come to someone and he's asked for some help. And he says, you loan it to him. He said, don't add to his burden by making him pay back more than what you actually loaned him to get him out of this crisis. Verse 26, if you ever take your neighbor's cloak as collateral, return it to him before sunset. For it is his only covering, it is the clothing for his body. What will he sleep in? And if he cries out to me, I will listen, because I am gracious. Now, there's a lot of explanation, and I'm sure that you're aware of this outer coat and the importance that it was. Now, the fact that someone takes the coat is a reminder they do owe the debt, and the debt needs to be paid. To not pay the debt off is as wrong as not helping somebody. And so they take the coat in order to remind them the debt must be paid, but it is to be turned back to them. If they didn't, they would sleep in this coat. It was a good heavy coat, and at nighttime, the poor person, that may be the only covering that they have. And if they were to become ill, that just adds to their suffering. And so he's saying, you return that to the person. It was an act of grace for them to do that. Now, I've invited someone from a ministry in our community called Mission Norman, and they have a wonderful ministry of helping those who are needing food. There are truckloads, literally truckloads, that come in every week that unload food that they keep in this beautiful storage building that looks like a grocery store, and people can show up who need food, and they have a ministry of going through and evaluating people and those kinds of things. They keep records of all of that, and our church has put them in our budget to support them. So I've asked a representative from that ministry to come and talk to us about that and help our church to understand this is one way that our church and others and this ministry are seeking to help people that are in desperate needs. You may have someone like that in your church that's doing that. The third point, God expects his people to protect the vulnerable. But the third point is from Leviticus 19, verse 9 through 10, and it's about reaping crops. And again, the application point is believers are to physically help those in need. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go through the explanation of the text. And there's a good explanation in your leader's guide about that. And basically, the Jews were told to leave the corners of their field unharvested, and that the poor could go into the fields and they could reap that and they would have food for themselves. They also were to only go through the field once and not go back through and gather up what they had either dropped on the ground or they had failed to reap. And many years ago, when I was a young man, I worked in the field, and we had to physically, without mechanical help, harvest this particular crop. And inevitably, no matter how careful you were, you left something, you overlooked something. And so this was God's way of providing for it. Now, you understand it's not a pickup and delivery service. The poor did have to go out and work for this and provide for it. And of course, a beautiful picture of that is in the book of Ruth. The same was true when it came to the vineyard. The grapes fell on the ground, or they failed to get them all off the tree. They were to leave them. And this is where the poor and the resident alien could be provided for. Since they didn't have a government that had a safety net, or they didn't have ministries that were established as safety nets, this was a way that the poor could be provided for. And the reason is because God is a compassionate God. So you can go through those passages and give explanation of that. And then to close the lesson out, I've invited someone from our Baptist Association who is involved in disaster relief. And his particular role is manning a shower trailer. And so when there's terrible things that have happened, they will move to an area and they'll set up this shower trailer that has washing machines. And the people who are in need of that can go and they can get a good shower and their clothes can be washed. And then also the people who are working have a place where they can go and they can have a safe environment in which to have a shower. And we have feeding trailers, we have mud out trailers, we have chainsaw trailers, all of that. And I want this man to be able to explain to our church that this is a ministry our church supports and they can get involved in, where believers are physically helping those who are in need. So my lesson is a bit different than in times past. And since I'm going to have these three testimonies of how God's people are ministering to the physical needs as well as the emotional and spiritual needs of people. The transition statement that is at the bottom of your leader's guide on page 97 says, God called the Israelites to show love for him and others. God's people today must have the same concern, including caring for vulnerable people around us. At Christmas, our churches do amazing work in ministering to people's needs. Is there something that God wants you to be involved in that is a more permanent work, that you would be involved in through most of this year or all of this year? Has something that's been said from the testimonies and the discussion of the class, has something been said that's drawn your heart toward something? Maybe that's why we had this lesson on the sanctity of human life, because God wants us to be concerned about the vulnerable. God bless you. Thank you for teaching God's word and bringing this before God's people.